Hello, my name is Colby Mazzarella, and this is Life Matters, a show that presents the pro-life movement in all its variety. And today, our guest today is Henry Luthin, a pro-life attorney from Boston.
Colby, how are you?
Good, thanks for being on the show
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Henry, you're working on something we'll be voting on soon, which is...
Yes, it's called the Death with Dignity Act. Mm-hmm. And last year, the proponents of the Death with Dignity Act gathered 70,000 or 69,000, something like that, signatures to put this on the ballot in November of 2012. The legislature has held hearings on it. About 11,000 more signatures are required, and I'm told the proponents have gotten those. So you and I will be voting on this in November.
So death with dignity, that sounds like a good thing.
Doesn't it, though? And why don't we have life with dignity?
Okay. what does it really mean?
The Death with Dignity Act is a proposed amendment to the general laws of the Commonwealth. It would put in Section 201G to the general laws, and this would enable persons who meet the qualifications to ask their doctor for a prescription for a lethal dose of medication to end their life. Mm-hmm. So
a poisonous pill or overdose of sedatives, or what is it? Whatever? Not specified?
Yeah, that's not specified. I believe it may be the same thing that is used to put together death row, to put to death death row patients. Uh-huh. Persons who may request this have to be over 18 years of age or over, Massachusetts residents. They have to have the capacity to make medical decisions. That is, they have to be capable, as that term is defined in the Act. And they must be suffering from a terminal disease which is likely to cause death within 6 months. In fact, it's defined as an incurable and irreversible disease which has been medically confirmed and will, within reasonable medical judgment, produce death within 6 months.
Well, how sure is reasonable medical judgment that you're going to die in 6 months?
I'm sure that you and I and many others know people who have been told that they would die within X number of days, weeks, months, and they have not fulfilled the prophecy. Yeah. Now, it's very interesting because this definition of terminal disease does not say whether the 6-month terminal period is with treatment or without treatment. For example, diabetes is an incurable and irreversible disease, and without insulin, it may well be that some people would die within 6 months.
So if you would die within 6 months from diabetes, but you could live for 40 years with insulin, you'd still qualify?
Yeah, you would still qualify.
So heart disease, if you needed blood pressure pills, or?
There's a whole host of things, and I think that is one of the problems I have with this act, and I think many others would too.
I guess after a certain age, most people have a disease that will kill them if they don't take pills.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably right.
So then, in that scenario, they would qualify for a prescription. So how does it work? You go to your doctor.
You go to your doctor, and or you're in a facility, and you make a verbal request for a prescription. And the Act is very clear: a prescription for medication to end your life in a humane and dignified manner. And this phrase, "in a humane and dignified manner," is a mantra throughout the Act. So you make this request. There has to be two actually oral requests and one written request in between. The medication, the prescription, can't be given until after the at least 15 days following the first oral request, 48 hours after the written request, and then you make the final oral request. And you're asked if you want to go through with this. And if you don't rescind, then you'll be given the prescription.
So you said a humane and dignified manner. Is it really humane and dignified?
Well, that's what the law says. So I think that anything, any medication prescribed and taken would be, and where death is produced, would, as a matter of law, be a humane and dignified death.
So they have decreed that it's humane and dignified. But let's think that through, though. Is what's humane about it and what's inhumane about it?
Well, you see, this is the problem. Suicide, which is what this is always a tragedy. It's the denial of life. You are essentially written off. In some form or fashion, you are writing yourself off. Nothing dignified about that.
Right. And how about humane as far as having human help, the humanity of it? How does that fit in?
Well, the humane thing is I think, to be accorded dignity while you're alive. And dignity is something that's accorded to, and something that we owe another person.
Well, you said, it's called the Death with Dignity Act, and you commented, why can't we have life with dignity, ongoing life. So do doctors, let's see now, when does it turn into a financial issue? We're on the verge of having government health care in a complete way in the United States, which is a very expensive project. How does that play into this whole situation?
Well, I suppose one would have to follow the money, but which I have not done. I think there are other things with this act that are very troubling. The failure to include treatment in the definition of what's terminal is one thing. Another thing is this written request that has to be made by the patient. The written request has to be witnessed by two people, one of whom may not be a relative by blood, marriage, or adoption, someone who owns or operates or works in the healthcare facility if the person is in that particular facility. And the third person may not be, or the third class of people who can't be one witness are those who would take under the will, either under the will or through intestacy, operation of law. So now that's great, but it means that one witness can be somebody who takes under the will or takes some share, has a right to some share in the person's estate.
So of the two witnesses at the death saying that this person did request the medication, one of them could be benefiting from the will, one of them could be a relative, one of them could be running the nursing home. That is a fair reading, I think, but I think that what they're trying to say is that one of them can't be either of these three classes of people, right, but
the other one could be one of these three people, one of these three classes. Another item is that the patient has to be capable, that is, having the capacity to make healthcare decisions and to communicate them to healthcare providers, including, and I'm quoting from the Act, communication through persons familiar with the patient's manner of communication. And that's in Section 1.3.
So if someone is sick and a little bit hard to understand, a little bit having difficulty communicating, someone who's familiar with, oh, that's what he means.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it could be a little difficulty, it could be a lot of difficulty.
Yeah. You had a whole scenario you worked out how it could progress with you say your Uncle Charlie. Oh. Someone's Uncle Charlie, this is how things would go along.
Well, I think, why don't we imagine the year 2020? And we imagine that this act has passed at the election in 2012 and came into law on January 1st, 2013. And we'll turn to Uncle Charlie, a formerly affable and still very rich bachelor. And at the age of 72, Uncle Charlie suffered a stroke which left him unable to speak. And further minor strokes have further impaired his mobility. So Uncle Charlie has recently been diagnosed with cancer and given 6 months to live. So within a week of his diagnosis, his favorite nephew, Felix, flies in from the West Coast with his girlfriend, Francesca. And Felix is the principal beneficiary under Uncle Charlie's last will and testament. And after spending some time with his favorite uncle, Felix informs the attending physician that Uncle Charlie has requested orally a prescription to end his life in a humane and dignified manner. Uncle Charlie's attending physician has made the determination that Uncle Charlie suffers from a terminal disease that will likely cause his death within 6 months, and that Uncle Charlie is capable, that is, he has the capacity of making a decision, except for this communication problem. But the physician interviews Uncle Charlie with Felix present as one familiar with Uncle Charlie's manner of communication. One grunt, Felix assures the attending physician, means yes. And a consulting physician confirms in writing Uncle Charlie's prognosis, diagnosis, and capacity, and Uncle Charlie is asked the question whether he wants the medication, and he grunts once. So the attending physician informs Uncle Charlie of his diagnosis, prognosis, the potential risks, this is all required in the act, of taking the medication, the likely result of taking the medication, and feasible alternatives, including hospice care, palliative care, and comfort care. It's interesting, the act does not require the attending physician to say anything about treatment.
So supposing that Uncle Charlie had a form of cancer that was treatable, but without any treatment it would kill him in 6 months. It doesn't say that he understands the treatment.
It does not.
Yeah.
It does not. So the following week, Felix and Francesca both witness Uncle Charlie's execution of a written request for the prescription for medication to end his life in a humane and dignified manner. As you know, Felix is an heir to the estate, but Francesca is not. So both of them being a witness are fully comply with the law. And Felix helps Uncle Charlie to sign the written request.
Because he doesn't have control of his hands from the stroke.
Right. But for heaven's sake, why that shouldn't be a deterrent.
You should have someone to help you, right?
And I think a court would find that. 15 days after the first oral request and more than 48 hours after the written request, Uncle Charlie makes his second oral request to the attending physician, again through Felix. The attending physician offers Uncle Charlie the opportunity to rescind his request. Uncle Charlie grunts twice, which means no. I don't think Felix pinched him, not in the record. Now, there were no witnesses when Uncle Charlie takes the medication, and the act does not require witnesses to be present. Felix and Francesca were, however, there when he did it, and the act does not require any recording of who happens to be with the patient at the time he takes the medication. The attending physician states on the death certificate that Uncle Charlie died of cancer and not of asphyxiation due to choking on the vomit induced by his medication.
That's something you mentioned about the law. It doesn't say you died from the suicide prescription.
No, it says that you die of the underlying terminal illness.
So the death certificate will not show that you would have lived 6 more months or whatever. It will show that you died from the disease, even though what killed you that day was the prescription. Was the prescription,
that's correct.
Yeah.
And you know, the Section 4.2 of the Act mandates that the death certificate list the underlying disease. So the Act itself
that's
is...
what it says you die from. That's deceptive. And the document of your death will be deceptive. It will say you died from the cancer or the diabetes or whatever, but it won't say you died from that chemical that you took.
That's correct.
Yeah. That's
correct. And you know, one could say that it would be the falsification of a public record. And then under the law, Uncle Charlie ended his life in a humane and dignified manner.
by definition because they said so.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, let's get back to that treatable, reversible. The law says if the disease is irreversible.
Right.
So we said, well, what if Uncle Charlie had cancer? If it was irreversible, if you could cure the cancer, he wouldn't qualify.
That's correct.
But if you could deal with it in a way that he could live indefinitely or for a longer period of time than 6 months, it doesn't. He could still qualify if he would die without treatment.
No, it's just still terminal and it's still irreversible.
Right.
Yeah.
So if it's irreversible, like diabetes, you can't reverse it, but you can treat it for decades.
Yes.
That would qualify. He'd die in 6 months without treatment. Therefore, he'd qualify for the pill.
That's correct. It's a very troubling act. Massachusetts would be the third state to legalize assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide.
What the other two states?
Oregon and Washington State. The Mass Medical Association took a resounding position in opposition to physician-assisted suicide and in opposition to this act. And that's one of the most troubling things about this is that it would, were this to pass, it would implicate the medical profession in dealing death.
Isn't that against the Hippocratic Oath?
Yes.
Add
it to the list.
First, do no harm. I will prescribe no. It doesn't specify suicide in the Hippocratic Oath, that I will not help a patient commit suicide.
It does, and but the Hippocratic Oath was breached about 40 years ago.
With abortion.
Yeah.
Maybe it will have to be called the hypocritical oath. There's a lot of groups working for it and against it. What can you tell me about some of these groups?
Well, the Massachusetts Against Doctor-Prescribed Suicide is one group. I think that if people are interested, they should contact Massachusetts Citizens for Life and or the Massachusetts Catholic Conference. Those groups have taken a leadership role against this ballot initiative. My understanding is that there are some disabilities rights groups that have mobilized against this particular ballot initiative.
What was the name of one of the groups?
Oh, Not Dead Yet.
One is Not Dead Yet. I know there's a number of them. What about groups for it, like Compassion in Dying? And that's a good thing, right? Compassion in Dying.
Yes, that's the renaming of the Hemlock Society.
Hemlock Society, that doesn't sound so good. That was the poisonous plant used for the suicide of Socrates, right? Is that right?
That's correct.
So,
founded by Derek Humphreys.
What do you know about that group and the name Compassion and the people, Derek Humphreys?
Well, they've been around for a long time, and they've been tireless advocates. And I don't impute any ill will on their part or lack of good faith. I think that they're trying to relieve suffering, and I think in a tragically mistaken way.
Well, compassion. What's true compassion for a person who's dying?
Well, I think it comes from the Latin meaning to suffer with.
Compassion, suffer with.
Yeah.
And what would really be an example? Instead of compassion with dying, compassion in dying is for this suicide law, but what would be true compassion for a dying person?
Well, I think true compassion would be to actually be with the person.
Give them your support.
Give them support, comfort.
I guess many sick people feel like dying at the worst point of their sickness, but with medication, with pain medication, with treatment for the disease, which is not mentioned in the will, and with compassionate comfort and support from people, we've all known people to turn around in the course of their disease and feel better and feel more hopeful and feel that they can deal with the remaining situation.
Absolutely.
How does this relate to having a healthcare proxy or?
Well, I think, back in the early 90s, Massachusetts enacted Section 201D of the general laws, which allows for anyone over the age of 18 or 18 years of age and over, to designate someone to be an agent to make all healthcare decisions for them should they become incapable of making decisions themselves.
So that would not fall under the law, would it? Because, or would it?
Well, I think that there might be a conflict with the law. It's interesting. Could a healthcare agent request the prescription on behalf of the principal, on behalf of the patient? Mm-hmm. There's a fascinating case from 1982. The Moe case, and it involves, in the matter of Mary Moe, it involves a tragic situation where a young woman who had been institutionalized suffered a quote-unquote sexual event, not defined in the opinion by Judge Liakos. Her mother brought an action in probate court to ask for an order for a sterilization. Mm-hmm. The mother was her guardian, mm-hmm. And actually the request was that she be allowed to consent to her daughter's sterilization. Section, I think it was 12S of Chapter 112 of the General Laws, same now as it was then, stated that sterilization could only be provided with the written consent of the person.
I see.
Now, obviously, this was not the person involved who was asking for the sterilization.
Right.
The Supreme Judicial Court allowed the request to go through.
So even though the law said you can only sterilize someone who agrees to be requested in writing, the guardian was allowed to do it.
That's correct.
So perhaps if we got the Death with Dignity Act, which says you have to be competent to make that decision, perhaps it would let a guardian or an advanced healthcare proxy person ask for you.
Perhaps it would, and I think that's something that is going to be one of the first things that's, first cases that's brought under this, should it pass.
I can see how that might be. Now, I know we've had legal prescribed suicide in other countries, like the Netherlands, other states, Oregon and Washington, and now proposed for Massachusetts. And so what are people doing to work for it or against it?
Well, people are getting involved with the groups that I've mentioned. Mm-hmm. Right now, things are very quiet. Historically in Massachusetts, campaigns don't begin until Labor Day, mm-hmm. but we have to work behind the scenes now and talk to people in our families, our churches, synagogues, our communities, and advocate for life. Point out what the flaws are in this bill. I think that anyone even who supports in principle the idea of allowing someone to end their life would have a problem with this bill as drafted. Mm-hmm. And it can't be amended, of course, mm-hmm. so this is either an up or down vote.
So it's a yes or no vote at the polls in November?
Right.
And one more time, if someone wants to help, what groups should they contact?
Immediately, I would say Mass Catholic Conference and Mass Citizens for Life.
Okay, Massachusetts Citizens for Life and Massachusetts Catholic Conference. Well, thank you very much, Henry, for being on our show.
Colby, thanks so much.
You're welcome. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next week on Life Matters.